This is a podcast 5 years in the making.
Whatever was like this wonderful surprise yesterday is what you feel entitled to today and isn't going to be enough tomorrow.
My guest on the show today is Dr. Robert Sapolsky, a professor at Stanford University, a world-leading researcher, the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, and a best-selling author.
There's an even more interesting ripple to testosterone. Testosterone makes you do whatever you need to do to hold on to status. Take 100 Buddhist monks and shoot them up with testosterone, and they're going to claw each other's eyes out to see who could do the most random acts of kindness. Ever since I was 14, I've been struggling with clinical depression. Depression is about having a nervous system that does not rebound from stress very well. I think there's no free will whatsoever.
How would you respond to the argument that any choice resulting from conscious deliberation demonstrates free will? I want to start off on the subject of dopamine. Dopamine, I have this quote from you that I'd love to explore. Dopamine is not about the pursuit of happiness. It's about the happiness of pursuit. I know this is a favorite quote of Andrew Huberman's. Could you take us through the difference?
Okay, dopamine. Everybody thinks they know about dopamine, which it's the neurotransmitter of pleasure. It's the neurotransmitter of reward. Cocaine releases dopamine. All sorts of euphoriants do that. But it turns out dopamine is actually much more interesting than that. It's not so much about reward and pleasure. It's about the anticipation of it. And even more so, it's about the work you were willing to do in order to get that reward, motivated behavior, goal-directed behavior, and such. It comes with all sorts of interesting facets to it. For one thing, what that begins to tell you is if dopamine is mostly about the period before you get the reward, when you're sitting there in the, this is going to be great, this is going to be fantastic, I'm just salivating there with that, it's telling you the happiness is mostly during the pursuit. Where that becomes particularly interesting is how likely you are to get that reward, how certain it is. If you do the work and you're a rat and you've pressed the lever 10 times, or if you're a student and you've studied hard for the exam, or any version of that, how likely are you to get the reward? And it turns out, very logical answer, which is if there's no chance you're going to get the reward, all you do is become helpless and dopamine's got nothing to do with it. If you're absolutely guaranteed to get the reward, you habituate to it pretty quickly. But if it's not quite clear, if you're sort of teetering on this fulcrum of maybe yes, maybe no, I'm feeling lucky today, but I'm such a screw up, and back and forth, teetering there at some psychological equivalent of a 50% chance, maximize the uncertainty. And that's when you pour out dopamine like crazy. So getting maybe calibrated to exactly right, that's where we really work like mad at trying to get what we're anticipated. And that's where the anticipation of it is just so pleasurable.
Dopamine's become one of those words that you hear a lot in the self-help space. You hear things about cheap dopamine and earned dopamine. Are these terms that are quite easy to define, or are those words that, you know, they're not very black and white?
Oh, I suspect they mean all sorts of wildly unscientific things as used, often related to opening up your wallet and sending money to someone or other. No, you know, it used to be like, oh my God, neurotransmitters. What could be more boring and obscure than saying the names of neurotransmitters? And now dopamine is all over the place. Yeah. It's interesting. It's subtle. We do things with it as humans that no other species can do out there, which helps explain some magnificent things we do. It also helps explain probably about 90% of human misery, sort of unique features of dopamine in humans. Different subtypes, nah, not really the science version of it. To add one more ripple of sort of subtlety, not only is dopamine about goal-directed motivation to get something you're anticipating like crazy, it's also about salience signals. This one's important. Pay attention to this. And of course, that intertwines very easily with, I really, really, really want to get this reward. So pay attention to whatever I think is the route by which that's going to happen. But yeah, it suffers from the dread problem of scientific jargon of, oh my God, it's become popular with the public.
Certainly. And another way, another word that's become popular in the same vein then is this idea of a detox, a dopamine detox. Is this something that we should pay no mind to when we see these, self-help books and podcasts talking about dopamine detoxing?
Well, I think as long as you don't view it as anything other than metaphor and not a particularly poetic metaphor, nonetheless is tapping into something very valid. You take, I don't know, some close relative species, you take a monkey, and what counts as pleasurable in the life of a monkey? Sex and desirable food, and maybe when it's hot, getting a spot in the shade and somebody grooming you, and that's about it. And you get to us, and the range of things that could be pleasurable range from, like, you've just spent 80 years carving a magnificent statue, to the flowers smell good, to an orgasm, to like a good haiku, or like an incredible range, including convincing yourself that because of ritualistic stuff you're doing, you're going to reach paradise after you're dead. Like all sorts of stuff that we humans, we have a wider range of pleasures and a wider range of things to anticipate by orders of magnitude than any other species out there. And the trouble is, you got the same dopamine dial for all of those that go to from 0 to 10. In us humans, it has to habituate really quickly. You need to be able to get a signal to the dopamine system that, okay, we're not doing multiple orgasms right now. Instead, we're going to do rhyming couplets in Victorian poetry. Rescale what 0 means and what 10 means and everything in between. What that means is the system has to habituate really fast, because it's got to be ready to scale up or down to whatever the next pleasure is you're anticipating. And what does that mean? Whatever was like this wonderful surprise yesterday is what you feel entitled to today, and isn't going to be enough tomorrow, because it habituates. And that's like this whole feature of us, that the more we eat, the hungrier we get.
Fantastic. And we've mentioned there a few things that people should look out for when they're listening to this subject, the cheap dopamine, the detoxes. But we've talked about things that we don't want people to pay attention to. But what is one thing that you wish more people understood about dopamine?
That we should be very on guard to the habituation. It is very, very easy. It is a necessity for how our brains are wired, that whatever flattens you with pleasure today really is not going to be enough tomorrow, and always be on guard with that. I mean, we all have versions of that. Oh my God, if only I could go back and have my first kiss again, the first time whatever. That's just a sort of representation of that. Be very on guard to the fact that we get hungry again way too easy. And maybe a way to constantly be on guard against that is to do some version of this detoxing metaphor, which is reflect on the pleasures, the artificial ones, the engineered magnitude more what the brain ever normally generates on its own. Be very aware of them because you habituate to them quickly. And because they so overpower your dopamine system, like we did not evolve for dealing with cocaine, for example, be aware that what that does is it makes everything else seem monochromatic afterward.
Amazing. So in terms of that habituation then, combating against that, is there anything we can do to combat against that? Or as you mentioned it, is it just a case of just being aware of it?
Well, part of becoming aware of it is suddenly finding yourself hungry for valid reasons rather than for just societally conditioned ones, which is to say, going back to appreciating stuff for what it is. I suppose that has some resemblance to this detox concept. But in that regard, like, go unplug, go back to basics, some version of that. Like, none of us want to go back to being hunter-gatherers, but going back to a world in which, at the very least, the pleasures we have bear some consonance with the brain chemistry we've got so that it's not going to overwhelm us and we're not going to desensitize and we're not going to find that we just get hungrier and hungrier.
I mentioned at the top of the show, this has been a conversation a few years in the making, and there's so many things I want to get to: dopamine, testosterone, depression. So if we were to move into the subject of testosterone now, one of the common beliefs around testosterone is that it makes people aggressive. I think everyone's sort of been taught that through, the mainstream narrative. And I've heard you explain that testosterone doesn't invent aggression, but it just exaggerates pre-existing social patterns of aggression. So does this myth around testosterone and aggression come from the fact that we tend to just reward aggression with status?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very easy answer to why, and like every culture on this planet, males are so much more of a pain in the ass than females when it comes to violence, in almost every mammalian species out there, and the exceptions are really interesting. But yeah, you kind of look at it in the times of life when testosterone levels are their highest. Adolescent males is when you see the most antisocial behaviors and things. That is really tempting to decide that you're seeing causality, and that it's testosterone that invents aggression. What testosterone is mostly doing is just upping the volume on whatever social learning about aggression you've already had. And what that means is if you're having a whole lot of problems with aggression in a society, the answer isn't to take out everybody's testes. The answer is to, exactly as you said, look at the things that are being exacerbated by testosterone: frustration, anxiety, fear, resentment, and look at the fact that it's being triggered by being rewarded for aggression and all sorts of circumstances that are pretty, maladaptive.
In one of your speeches on testosterone, you give the example of what would happen to maybe a group of monks in an ashram if you just jocked them up on testosterone. What would happen there?
Well, this is one of the most interesting things out there. Okay, so you go through your, like, let's be more subtle than saying testosterone causes aggression. Testosterone exacerbates pre-existing social aggression. Testosterone is not causative. It's modifying. It's modulatory. Go through all of this. But then you find out there's an even more interesting ripple to testosterone, which is it's not so much doing any of these things as much as testosterone makes you do whatever you need to do to hold on to status when it's being challenged. Okay, so you're a baboon. What does your status being challenged consist of if you're male, and how do you respond to it? It's an aggressive whatever. Yeah, testosterone and responding to a challenge and aggression are just going hand in hand. But then you get to us, and there's something much more interesting going on there, which is we can get status in all sorts of unlikely ways. We can be status filled by making the biggest charitable contribution and having our name put on the building that our family's stolen fortune is endowed, or some such thing like that. We can gain status by being the most conspicuously kind. We can gain status in certain economic games by making more generous offers rather than more backstabbing ones. And what you see is, framed that way in terms of human complexity, you take a circumstance, you get people playing an economic game where you accrue status by making more generous offers, fill people up with testosterone without them knowing whether it's that or saline, and people become more generous. Wow. When you get more status brownie points by being generous, testosterone fuels that. And thus sort of this picture that, take 100 Buddhist monks and shoot them up with testosterone, and they're going to claw each other's eyes out to see who could do the most random acts of kindness. Testosterone and aggression aren't, it's just, what does aggression mean in your society? And if that's what you're handing out in terms of status and who you vote for and who you mate with and who you hand out medals to and things like that, then you're going to see the usual relationship between testosterone and aggression. It's whatever society is valuing. That's the thing that males tend to mobilize testosterone for when they're feeling like it's under assault.
So amazing. So if testosterone is more of a status seeking than aggression, then the way in which we behave individually is a lot down to our sort of social and physical context that we're in at that time.
Exactly. Like you can get away with some pretty hard and fast rules of what hormones and neurotransmitters are doing to behavior if you're like a sea snail. It's pretty straightforward there and pretty predictable. We're so damn idiosyncratic and individuated and so culturally contextualized in our sub-micro culture that applies to you and 3.5 of your friends, that it's always coming with these qualifiers. Like all of this biology is always occurring in the context of someone and their psyche and the sort of society in which that person and their brain and hormones are going about their daily business.
I think it was in the same talk actually that I mentioned at the start of the topic of testosterone. There is where you talk about oxytocin, and that this is well known for being a hormone that promotes social bonding. But you argue that it can actually contribute to driving a divide between us and them, so to speak.
Exactly. It's the same. Like insofar as testosterone has horrible public relations, oxytocin can't seem to do anything that makes people think it's other than the most wondrous, heartwarming hormone on earth out there. Oxytocin has been around for about 150 million years, and its usual original job was to make mothers and infants bond with each other. And that's like a pretty good adaptive thing to do. We humans and another species have done totally bizarre stuff with that property of oxytocin in the last 20, 30,000 years or so, which is when you look at your beloved dog and the two of you make eye contact for a long period of time, you both secrete oxytocin and you both make longer eye contact if they've pumped you up with oxytocin before. So like we take this mother-infant bonding thing and like we've got it with like our pets now, and particularly in women and their pets. Okay, so that's your basic oxytocin. And then like some species invented pair bonding and monogamy, and oxytocin got used for that. And then species got socially complex and started having things like trusting or not trusting other individuals. And oxytocin makes you more trusting and makes you more generous and makes you better at reading emotions and more expressive and all that, which leads you to the obvious conclusion that they should just be dumping vats of oxytocin in the water supplies. But then the wrinkle comes in. And this was first shown, this wonderful study, this researcher, behavioral endocrinologist, Karsten de Drew in the Netherlands, like such a cool study. You take people, in this case, you take like college freshmen and like intro psych in the Netherlands, and you tap into a cultural feature in the Netherlands, which is what are the two ethnic national groups that have the most negative connotations in the Netherlands? Germans, oh, right, World War II, that was kind of unpleasant, and people with Muslim names, reflecting some of the current xenophobia there. Okay, so you take your volunteer and you give him this classic problem in philosophy, the runaway trolley problem. Trolley, it's broken loose from its brakes, it's hurtling down the track, it's going to kill 5 people who inconveniently have been tied to the tracks there, and you've got a choice. You can pull a lever and divert the trolley onto a side track where it kills 1 person. Is it okay to kill 1 person to save 5? Utilitarian philosophy out the wazoo there. And what's fascinating about it is you get totally different decisions by people depending on the wording and the context and if they're hungry and if the room smells bad. And so it's very psychologically malleable. So they took these Dutch students and they did something unique. Here's this one individual where you have to decide, are you going to kill him or not to save 5? Is that morally acceptable to you? And they give that person a name. And in some cases, they give him some good old boy Dutch name like Peter or Dirk or something. And the rest of the time, it's either a stereotypical German name, Wolfgang, or a stereotypical Islamic name, Muslim name, Ahmed or something. And people just go about, the students doing this, making their decisions, and the name doesn't have much of an effect. Give people oxytocin without them knowing it, and suddenly you are way more intent on sparing the life of good old Dirk or Peter, and you're jumping out of the chair to throw Ahmed or Mahmoud or Otto underneath the bus there. It makes you more xenophobic. It makes you nicer and more prosocial to, as you noted before, whoever counts as an us. But it makes you a whole lot crummier to thems. It makes people more preemptively aggressive. It makes them more backstabbing in economic games when they believe they're playing against a them instead of an us. Oxytocin doesn't make you nicer. It makes you nicer to people who you already think deserve to be treated nicely, people who remind you of yourself, us's.
Wow. It's amazing, really, that, we know this, yet, as you mentioned, oxytocin seems to have the best PR team on the planet. I think we all need whoever their PR rep is.
Hey, we all need to sign up for that one. And it's unshakable. Oxytocin, you even see like embarrassing things like from scientists who really should know better than to say crap like this, using words like the love hormone, where it's just, I'm embarrassed for these compatriots of mine steeping that lowly. But yeah, it's more complicated than that, like virtually everything in biology that's got something to do with behavior.
Well, I want to talk to you, and I know a lot of our listeners requested I ask you about the topic of depression. Now, your lectures on depression have been viewed by millions of people. If you just take a quick look on YouTube, everyone listening. So I've got a bit of a personal question for you, in that, have you ever been really down in those pits yourself? And if so, how did you get out?
Oh, I would say ever since I was 14, I've been struggling with clinical depression ever since I was 14 and decided there's no God. There's no free will. The universe is empty and indifferent and without like purpose or meaning. So, I kind of been teetering downhill from there. I'm one of those idiotically self-activated internal locus of control idiots who spent 20 years thinking I should be able to fight through this on my own. Depression, which at some points were incapacitating to me, until finally I listened to some of the damn science I lecture about and finally did what I had been advised to do since I was a teenager, which is try some medication. And that's been life-saving ever since. So yeah, I do not come to this subject as an indifferent outsider.
Yeah. I mean, just as you mentioned, that's a lot for a 14-year-old to take on. I think, there's a big things to be thinking about. I think at 14 years old, I think I was thinking about Pokemon cards. So,
well, if I was your age group, I probably would also, but I would have found some reason to be depressed by Squirtle or whatever those are.
He does that to you. He does that to you.
Yes.
So you say that just like diabetes, then depression is rooted in biology. What is going on in the brain and the body when someone is going through clinical depression?
Well, you can describe it on a number of different levels. And just as an aside, that lecture that I did for Stanford that they put up on YouTube 12 years ago on basically biology and psychology, depression and their interactions, it was getting kind of dated. So about 6 months ago, I posted an updated version of the lecture, which I think if you go to the old one, it will now point you to. And thank God, some of the science has advanced since then. If you want to just think about depression on a neurochemical level, which is the most bloodless way of doing this, it's most likely involving too little of this neurotransmitter serotonin, probably too little of dopamine, too little of another transmitter, norepinephrine. What are they doing in a very rough way? The depletion of dopamine has something to do with the loss of pleasure and loss of anticipation of pleasure and loss of motivation, all that stuff from before. The depletion of norepinephrine probably has something to do with what's termed psychomotor retardation in depression. Everything's exhausting. Go out and get a hobby. You can't even do your laundry. You're so just flattened by everything. And what the shortage of serotonin seems to have something to do with is the symptom of rumination. You get a sad thought in your head and it just goes over and over and over again and you can't stop it. Interestingly, a shortage of serotonin probably also has something to do with people with obsessive compulsive disorder, where it's not sad thoughts, but it's instead these compulsive thoughts of, I need to make the pencil sharpened all over again. I need to get the utensils that much more, parallel to each other and you're just caught in loops there. In depression, the rumination is in loops of just sad thoughts that will not stop. And serotonin shortage seems to have something to do with that. So what is depression? It's something screwed up with those neurotransmitters. And there's a half dozen other ones that are relevant as well. On a different level, what is depression about? Depression is about having a nervous system that does not rebound from stress very well. And you look at depression, the developmental roots of it, the fact that when people have their first major depressive episode, their first 3 or 4, it's usually coming right after some major stressor. It's after 3 or 4 that you're really screwed, that the depressions begin to cycle all on their own without having to have an external trigger. But depression is completely mired in stress. Lose a parent to death before you're 10 years old. And for the rest of your life, you are more vulnerable to clinical depression. And when you look at what stress and stress hormones are doing to our usual suspects, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, et cetera, what you see is any of us go through something stressful and awful and tragic or whatever, and we grieve and we feel awful, and the thoughts keep running through our heads, and we have no pleasure and we have no energy and all of that. And in the majority of us, we heal. We come out the other end of it. And translating that into neuroendocrinology, the system is able to re-equilibrate after a while. And in that regard, what depression is about is your system biologically sucks at re-equilibrating after major stressors. And after a while, it gets knocked out of equilibrium even without a stressor triggering it. So on that level, it's that. Finally, at sort of the more psychological level, what depression is about is you've been trained by life to feel helpless and hopeless and without efficacy. And often that's built around this cognitive distortion that, yeah, that thing that happened to you back when, that was for real. That truly was. Your loved one did die when you were 8 years old. You did fail at whatever. This was unrequited, that tragic. Yeah, those were for real. And where the problem comes in is when you then overgeneralize it to deciding, and not only did I fail then, not only was I abandoned then, I will always fail and I will be abandoned, all that. And it becomes this globalized worldview, and you're helpless and you're hopeless. And if you really want to add some frosting on top, you decide somehow you deserve it. And it just comes with terrible. So we've got this neurotransmitter nuts and bolts disorder. We've got this disorder of stress and adversity in life, kicking some of us more in the rear than others because of the genetics of vulnerability to stress. The vulnerability to depression genetically is that you get knocked more on your ass by challenges than most people do, and you don't re-equilibrate as readily. And then on sort of this emotional cognitive level, you see despair and helplessness everywhere you look. And it seems inevitable and unchangeable. And the coolest thing is, like, we know how to tie the serotonin, dopamine, etc. level to the stress hormone level to the cognition of over the pieces all fit together, along with the genes that make you more vulnerable to all of that. So it's like, it's biology. It's screwed up biology. It's not that you don't have backbone. It's not, oh, come on, stop babying yourself. It's not, oh, come on, look, everybody gets ups and downs, and like, come on, stop indulging yourself. It's, as you said, it's like taking somebody with type 1 diabetes and saying, oh, what's with this insulin stuff? Stop babying yourself. Just buck up and you won't need any more insulin. It's a biological disorder, which, like every biological disease, is intertwined with context and social factors and psychological stuff, even stuff like cancer and diabetes. But by the time you get to a psychiatric disorder like crazy, but just like cancer and diabetes, it is moored in biology. It's a disease. It's not, you don't have what it takes.
On stress, which you mentioned there. Now, I'm not a religious person, but I've always envied the comfort that must come with having a faith to turn to. How does a religious worldview or a faith help combat stress?
It's wonderful, at least on the surface. And I say this as someone who was raised as devoutly, ritualistically religious, where it all evaporated when I was 14. And I've been incapable of anything like that, any spirituality, anything. So I am definitely viewing it as an outsider to it. It's great. It's fabulous. Like, what is it that makes life psychologically adverse? Like, straight out of the depression cognition picture, psychological stress is when you feel like you have no control over what's happening, when you feel like you're getting no predictability over when the bad stuff is coming and how bad it's going to be, when you have no outlets to release the frustration caused by it, when you interpret things as meaning that it's going to get worse rather than better, and when you don't have social support. These are the building blocks of psychological stress, and they're hugely powerful. And what does religion do? It gives you explanation. It gives you, even the most flimsy, useless one out there, God works in mysterious ways. It gives you it gives you a sense of control, as in there's some omnipotent being who listens to people like you when you invoke your prayers for them. And best of all is if you can get the psychological mindset that on top of everything, they especially listen to you because you especially are talking to them. And then throw in the fact that whether God or Jesus or whoever is your secret best friend, the fact that religiosity typically gets you a big social community. It's great. It's great. You get all these psychological buffers against life, with a couple of problems though. The biggest one being that often the solutions are things that make things worse. Your coping mechanisms are pretty bad ones. And crusading is not necessarily a good response to some of life's disappointments and framing it religiously. But probably more importantly, depression, religiosity is great. It's great. It extends your lifespan. It is absolutely documented to be better for your health, in some subtle ways. All of that is great. And it's anxiety reducing, because you got explanations, you got answers, and you got a framework saying that it'll work out well in the end, or somebody with a lot of fingers on the buttons loves you, or some such thing, until you realize religiosity is very good at decreasing anxieties that were invented by religiosity in the first place. And thus, you're constantly having to run faster and faster to stay in the same place, to keep them at bay.
Now, you've already alluded to this time in 14-year-old Robert Sapolsky's life when he's thinking deeply about religion. He's also thinking about free will. Now, what is happening in a young Robert Sapolsky's life at this time that forms his opinion on free will?
Oh, I was having a very, very personal religious crisis, built around something over which I had no control, which was very, very adversely affecting my quality of life, and a something with which, within the religious framework in which I was being raised, I would be judged negatively by God for. And this seemed beyond incompatible and impossible. And wait a sec, you create the world, including my being this way that I am. And wait, now I get judged harshly by you because of that? How screwed is that? Wait, how do I reconcile? And, waking up literally one night at 2 a.m. as a 14-year-old saying, oh, I get it. There is no God, and there is no free will, and we're just biological machines. And that religious crisis evaporated. The world has seemed like a depressing place ever since, but at least that took care of that problem. So yeah, that was mired in, there's a whole world of people who stop believing in gods and people who stop believing in free will out of just reasoning your way through the absurdity of those unfalsifiable belief systems. In my case, it was purely emotional. This just feels intolerable that this could be what the world is like if this is the contradiction that I've arrived at here.
So last week I was watching a lot of the debates and conversations you've had with people on the subject of free will. And I stumbled across this article that someone called the Sapolsky Paradox, which I'd like to put to you here today. So the Sapolsky Paradox then, in that if you decide free will does not exist by weighing up the arguments for and against it, you prove it exists. If you read or listen to an argument that it doesn't exist and then agree with that, then you are literally exercising free will. How would you respond to the argument that any choice resulting from conscious deliberation demonstrates free will?
Well, not surprisingly, I think there's no paradox at all. My stance, I'm way, way out in the lunatic fringe of sort of neuroscientists and sort of radical materialists, in that I think there's no free will whatsoever. I think it is simply not how life works. But why is there no paradox with it? Because one is getting suckered in by the most tempting misstep to take when considering that we have no free will, which is dealing with like this abundantly clear fact that we change. Things change. Our behaviors change, cultures change, societies change, and the world is full of, not enough of them, but at least some ex-white supremacist neo-Nazis who changed, change happens. Change happens. And where people then believe they have hit this wall of incompatibility with thinking there's no free will is the notion that you have chosen to change. None of us choose to change. We are changed by circumstance. And the change that any circumstance evokes in us is a function of who we turned out to be when we experienced that circumstance. And when you frame it that way, that's exactly what occurs. Change happens, but not because we choose to do so. You get two people, they go into a movie theater and watch this movie, some like wonderfully inspirational movie, I don't know, Gandhi or who knows what. And they both come out of the experience changed. They are both changed. They do life differently afterward. They form different intents and act upon them than they did before the movie. One of them comes out and says, that's the most inspiring thing I've ever seen. I'm going to give up my worldly possessions tomorrow. And the other person comes out and says, that's the most amazing cinematography I've ever seen. I'm going to quit my job tomorrow and study at the feet of the cinematographer. Wow, you've been changed. You changed. You didn't choose to change. You've been changed by the circumstance. And these were not remotely the equivalent people, similar people going in there. Whatever it is that made them who they were, which is to say their lifetime of biology over which they had no control, and its interaction with environment over which they had no control, determines how you were going to respond to this external factor. And where things get particularly seductively complicated for people saying, oh, there's got to be free will, just look at how we do this or that, is when you then come out of there and you say something like, wow, I had no idea that's what went on in India's liberation from the British Empire or whatever. I knew nothing about. I'm going to go read up more on this. I'm going to acquire more information about that. Whoa, free will. I'm going to go read up more on this. How did you become someone who values reading? How did you become someone privileged enough in society that you're not working 3 jobs and you can actually go and read stuff? How did you become lucky enough that you're in a society that has things like books, et cetera, et cetera? No, all that you have done there is you have learned, not only are we like every other species out there, biological machines, we're the only ones who could learn something about where the buttons and the levers are. And you have just learned, you did not choose to learn, but you have just learned by your prior experience with reading and efficacy and who knows what, that this is something you could now do to reinforce what it is you came out of that movie thinking. I mean, that's what we're doing every single time when we say, oh my God, I'm not going to watch the news for 2 weeks because it's so upsetting. you understand the wiring somewhere in there that, like, finding out what's going on in this or that corner of the world or this or that corner of the American political landscape. That's one of the buttons, that's one of the connections. And then it'll depend on if you turned out to be the sort of person who could stick with that resolution. In all these cases, you can change and you can become the catalyst for your changing further. And you can actively become a catalyst for other people changing around you, all because you were changed and as a function of who you turned out to be over which you had no control. All of that is completely compatible with there being no free will at all.
I've mentioned that, you have had these conversations and debates with so many people, and this is all on YouTube. And one of the most recent example earlier this year, you actually sat down to debate with the late Daniel Dennett earlier this year, which was billed at the time as the two titans of the free will debate. How did that conversation at all change your mind on anything, or did it reaffirm anything, or what were your reflections now on that conversation these months later?
It affirmed, okay, I have to say something childish here. It was some BBC debate venue or something. I don't remember what, but the moderator did something that seemed very like gauche or something beforehand, which he asked the audience to vote on whether or not they believed in free will. And the majority did. And then afterward, he took the vote again and the numbers had completely switched. Ooh, wow. Triumph. Okay. But more substantively, Daniel Dennett, amid having been a wonderful spokesperson for atheism, and famously so, he was one of the most die-hard compatibilists. It is possible to admit the world is made out of things like atoms and molecules and stuff, and somehow still there's this magical thing for free will. And when you look closely at what his arguments were, what he was a terrible victim of intuitionism. When you cut through a whole lot of really philosophical foliage and stuff, what he was saying over and over and over again is, when I make a choice, it just feels so much like I just made a choice. And even in that, he says, oh, I just took out a new mortgage on my house last week. I could have used that money to do this instead or that, and I chose to do that. You're not telling me. And I said, how do you become the sort of person where it would occur to you that you'd want to get a new mortgage? And going through that with him, speaking very tentatively about the deceased, because he died a couple of weeks later. He had a mixture of a great deal of faith in intuition, and intuition is a lousy litmus test for how the world works. And he also had, I think, an abundance of satisfaction and desire to take credit for the fortune he had in his life. He was a very well-positioned guy in the hierarchy of what society doles out. And he spent an awful lot of time basically saying, people make themselves who they are. Luck evens out over time. If you're successful, you deserve that award. You earned it. You're entitled. And sort of what he, with his intuitionism, was constantly getting caught up with, was the second great seductive thing about believing there's still free will. The first one is, whoa, people change. We all change. We have free will. The second is his intuitive sense that in the moment when you were choosing what brand of some gewgaw you're going to buy at the store or whatever, you are choosing, you form an intent and you act upon it, and you could have done otherwise. That is just so tangible in that moment of intent that's where the intuition swamps you and you decide you have just shown free will. And where the problem is with that is deciding that intent is your determinant of whether or not you've just shown free will, whether free will exists, misses 99% of what's going on, which is, so how did you turn out to be the sort of person who would form that intent at that moment? That's the only thing worth asking. And just saying, ooh, did you intend to do that when you did that? And did you know you didn't have to do that? You were not being coerced, is like asking somebody what they thought of a book where all they've done is read the last sentence. The only question to ask is, so how do you become the sort of person who would have that intent at that point? For the simple reason that no matter how much you may want to, you cannot successfully intend to do different than what you intend. You cannot successfully wish for something different from what you wish for. You cannot will yourself to have more willpower. And the fact that in that moment that feels so palpable, that's just falling for focusing on the last second when all that matters is history. And the intuitionism that says, I just made a decision and acted upon my intent in that moment, is something that says history doesn't exist. And all there is history. How do you become you?
Well, what a fantastic way to round out the conversation. And just before I let you go, I'm going to ask you one final question that I ask every guest who comes on the show, regardless of their career or profession. And that question is, for Robert Sapolsky right now, what makes life worth living?
Family, my wife, my kids, who I don't even have words for the biological phenomenon of feeling purpose from their happiness. My dog, who's just took a pillow in his mouth that he's going to rip unless I pull it away from him. A sense of solving puzzles, a sense that there's structure underneath the surface of things, which is to say, like what scientists get turned on by, I don't know, that's cool stuff. And the fact that some of the science abstraction stuff is actually relevant to, God help me for using a word like this, a phrase, but is relevant to issues of social justice. Like when science teaches us there's no free will, things like blame and punishment make no sense at all. And things like hating someone makes as little sense as hating a hurricane. So that is very pleasurable to me, that this abstraction of like how the pieces fit together happens in this case to point in a direction where it might make, life a little bit better for some people.
So it's been an honor to finally speak to you, sir. And I really appreciate your time today.
Well, my pleasure. And thanks for sticking with those follow-up emails. This has been fun.